So today we're going to talk about vocal communication and language. And before we really start, I want to get some definitions out of the way. So vocalization or speech is essentially just the movement of your vocal structures to produce some sort of noise, okay? Communication is another important thing to define. And this is the conveyance of information from one individual to another. So for example, if a dog barks, if a cat meows, these are both forms of vocalization, and they are both forms of communication. But neither one of those is actually language. Okay, so even if you think that like your cat meows in one way when it's angry or like another way when it's hungry or whatever, that's still not language, okay? Because language is really defined in a number of ways, but one of the most high-level definitions or components to its definition, one of the things that's the most difficult to satisfy, let's say, is that language requires the ability to assemble arbitrary symbols, which can be words or letters or sounds, into a structure that conveys complex meaning. And that this can produce essentially an infinite number of possible meanings. Okay, so by just assembling a bunch of words that you know the meanings to, you can create an infinite array of complex ideas, right? So if I said like that, you know, green and pink striped hippopotamus was eating a polka dot banana or something like that, right? Somebody may not have ever said that before, but everybody knows what I mean, right? Because you know the words that I'm saying, and so you can assemble those words into the idea of this situation, okay? And so that's language, and that is arguably what humans can do, and possibly, you know, we can get into this later, other animals are not necessarily capable of. Okay, so there's a learning objective to be able to distinguish between vocal communication and language. Any questions about that? So today we're going to talk a lot about a form of vocal communication that is not language, but is a really nice model for aspects of how humans actually produce language, and this is songbird singing, okay? And the reason why this is such a great model is that although it's not language, and it is a form of vocal communication, and it is learned, just as we learn how to speak and how to use language. And so there are a number of songbirds. The most famous experimental model of a songbird is the zebra finch, and they produce a relatively stereotyped song that can differ from individual to individual and also from, you know, region to region a little bit, but has a fairly characteristic signature. And so this is what a spectrograph of that song looks like in a basic sense, and this is the same kind of thing as what we saw with bats, right? Where essentially what they're graphing is over time here, the frequencies that are being produced. And you see like these sort of fuzzy areas of like mixed frequencies and then these up and down sweeps, etc. And these create syllables that the animal can then assemble into this song. So there's a lot of evidence that birds use, or that birds learn their songs, or these particular types of songbirds learn their songs. And so this comes down to, first of all, if you take an individual, like an egg, and raise it in isolation, but then expose it to adults of you know, another set of adults, not its own parents, it will develop songs that resemble the song that it's hearing from those other birds, okay, which is known as the tutor song. Birds raised in isolation like with no access to other birds, produce extremely abnormal songs that don't have the normal structure to them. And then there are even, as I alluded to earlier, geographically localized dialects of some songbird songs that are clearly like taught to one another in particular regions. So this is again a spectrograph of a zebrafinch song, and this is what it sounds like. Okay, we couldn't hear that. Oh, there it goes. Okay. We'll try this one more time. Okay, so hopefully people heard that. I don't know why it's so quiet, but that's what those zebrafinch song sounds like, and so you can hear the distinction between these various syllables that it sings. So if you take a zebrafinch and you look at, let's say, a juvenile's song in relation to its parent's song, which acts as the tutor song, you can compare the structure of those two songs to look at how closely they match. So let's say the tutor song looks like this. There are all of these syllables that are arranged in a particular order, right? A, B, C, D, E, F, etc., that they will tend to repeat. As the juvenile is just starting to learn the song, it doesn't bear a lot of resemblance to the tutor song in the beginning, but then over time you start to see emergence of things that are recognizable as the syllables of the tutor song, and then eventually this crystallizes into the adult song of that particular bird. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a perfect copy of the tutor, but it will very closely resemble the tutor song if nothing has gone wrong. On the other hand, if you look at the song of an isolated bird, as I mentioned, these are very abnormal because they don't have the tutor song to compare it to, and so they bear no resemblance in structure. There are different types of songbirds that exhibit different temporal organization of how they learn their songs. So there are types of songbirds like sparrows that actually have discrete phases of song learning. So there is a period of time where these birds just listen, okay? So they listen to the songs in their environment, and they essentially then store a tutor version, a template of the song, and then later in the season, they start practicing it. That's the sensory motor period, where they are singing and then listening to themselves sing, and then later in the year, it becomes crystallized. On the other hand, some animals, like zebrafinches, have overlapping sensory and sensory motor periods. So even while they're starting to practice, they can still modify the tutor template in their brain, and then this becomes crystallized. And then there are some birds that are open learners, which means that basically they can learn new songs, sometimes whenever they want in certain cases of birds, but often it's a seasonal thing. So like every season they can learn a new song or something like that. So we're going to be talking a lot today about this sensory motor period and the neural circuits and mechanisms that underlie sensory motor learning. So, as I mentioned, the bird needs to hear its own song while it's learning to sing. Okay, so this is during the sensory motor period, and some evidence for how important that is comes from the fact that if you take a bird and you expose it to the tutor song during the sensory period, but then you deafen the bird during its sensory motor period, it will not learn the song correctly. Okay? On the other hand, if you expose a bird to the tutor song during its sensory period, and then it never hears that song again, as long as it has its own hearing intact so it can hear its own song, it will practice and then eventually match that tutor song. So it really does store a template of that tutor song, and then through practice, we'll try to match it over time. And so there is a model of how this works that we're going to go through in various ways. And basically the idea is this. There are some motor nuclei in the bird's brain that control the production of song. And so when the bird sings, it makes noise. It then hears the noise, the singing that it's making. That produces auditory feedback. And then what essentially happens is that they evaluate that auditory feedback by asking the question, how close is what I'm hearing to the template that I've stored of the tutor song? Okay? If it's not very close, then they will change what they're singing in an attempt to get closer to the tutor song template. All right, so they evaluate the mismatch between the song and the stored template, and that will produce an instructive signal that will change the motor program, and then they just reiterate this, right? And so they sing again. Is that closer? If it is, okay, great. Maybe I'll change it a little bit more to get it even closer, etc. So through this iterative cycle, they more and more closely match their own song, which is known as BOS, or bird's own song, to the tutor song. Any questions about that? So songbirds have been studied for a really long time, and people have done very classic neural tracing kind of experiments way before the days of, you know, these viruses that we've talked about in mice and stuff that you can use to trace circuits. People were labeling neurons in the bird brain and tracing from these various nuclei, and then basically like lesioning these nuclei to see what it did to the bird's song. And through doing this, they identified a number of areas that they classified into two different pathways. The green pathway here, so all of those nuclei, or little areas in the brain that are color-coded green here, comprise the motor pathway. So this is the circuit that's actually required for the production of the song. If you ablate any of these nuclei, the bird can't sing, okay? Whether it's learned the song or not, whether it's trying to learn it, it just can't sing, because these are involved in the actual song production. On the other hand, the orange pathway is called the anterior forebrain pathway, and these are nuclei that are involved in modifying the song and in learning, but are not required for the production of song per se. So as I mentioned, the motor pathway is required throughout the life of the bird for song production, whereas AFP is not required, but is important during learning and also the plasticity of that song. So if you lesion anything within the anterior forebrain pathway, this will prevent the production or the learning of a normal song in a juvenile. If you disrupt the activity using pharmacology in a particular structure that we're going to focus on called L-MAN, during the exposure to the tutor song, this also prevents proper song learning, suggesting that L-MAN is involved somehow in the acquisition of the template, let's say, and we think that it's possibly involved in the matching of the bird's own song to the template. And part of the evidence for that comes from this third point, which is that when you record from neurons in certain areas of the AFP, they actually become increasingly more responsive to the bird's own song as it oh, I guess. All right. So some neurons become increasingly more responsive to the bird's own song or the tutor song. I think what I was trying to say there too is that essentially there are neurons that become more active to the bird's own song as it becomes closer and closer to the tutor song. Okay? And they think that AFP is involved in then the matching of the bird's own song to the tutor song, so the closer it gets, the more activity you see in these neurons. So one of the most elegant demonstrations of the role of the AFP, and in particular L-MAN, comes from an experiment done back in the late 90s by a couple of researchers at University of California, San Francisco. And the actual experiment was quite simple. If you deafen a bird, before deafening the bird, it has its normal song, right? This is an adult bird. It's learned a song. It can sing it fine. If you deafen the bird and then look a month later, the song is basically unrecognizable. If you look a year later, it's definitely unrecognizable. Okay? So deafening produces progressive disruption of the song over time. Even a crystallized song, okay, that seems to be very stable, if the bird can't hear itself, it will lose its song. On the other hand, if you take a bird and you deafen it, but you also lesion L-MAN, okay, so you're removing the function of L-MAN, then you see something very different. A month later, the song basically looks the same. A year later, the song still basically looks the same. So this is pretty amazing because what it demonstrates is that L-MAN is actually necessary for the degradation of the song after the bird gets deafened. And what that means is that the song degradation itself is an active process post-deafening. And what they think is happening is that essentially, when the bird gets deafened, every time it sings the song, because it can't hear it anymore, that lack of hearing the song produces a big mismatch between what it thinks it should be hearing and what it is hearing, which is nothing. And so it changes the song. And then they still can't hear anything, so there's a big mismatch, and they change the song again, and then the song degrades. Okay, so that's illustrated in this set of diagrams. These are all versions of that previous little circuit I showed you involving auditory feedback. And the basic idea is that as the bird is learning, this is what we've talked about before, right? The song motor nuclei are producing a song. It's listening to its own song. It's evaluating it. And there's a large instructive signal here because the song that the bird is singing is not very closely matched to the tutor song, to the template, right? And so they change it to try to more closely match that. However, when it becomes an adult, now the song basically sounds the same as the template because it's learned its own song. And so now it listens to the auditory feedback. There's a great match here, and so it produces little or no instructive signal to change the song, and that's why the song is stable. On the other hand, if you interrupt auditory feedback, as shown in C here, now we lack that signal. Now there's a big mismatch again in the AFP, presumably, wherever it's matching the template to the song. And that is going to produce a large instructive signal, but this instructive signal is non-adaptive, right? So this is this is actually working against the production of normal song because it's this big instructive signal when they're already singing the song correctly, and so the song degrades. On the other hand, if you not only block auditory feedback, but also then block that instructive signal, which it's clear that LMAN is a part of, now the song remains stable again because that instructive signal isn't there. Okay, so auditory feedback in and of itself isn't required to maintain the song. It's that the lack of auditory feedback causes an active degradation of the song. That might sound like it's the same thing, but it's actually an important distinction, right? Because you don't actually need it as long as your LMAN isn't providing some instructive signal to change the song. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Is this dopamine regulated?
Very good question. Is this dopamine regulated? Absolutely, it is. And this is actually really recent work, so like last 5-ish years or so. You perhaps astutely have recognized that this is a system that bears a lot of resemblance to what we've talked about in the basal ganglia, right? Where like you do an action, if it's right, you get some dopamine that reinforces the action, so you do it again. It's exactly that, okay? So this is actually all happening in the basal ganglia of the birds, and dopamine is that signal. So if the bird is singing and the song is a good match, then they get dopamine that reinforces that. If it's a bad match, then those dopaminergic neurons are inhibited, and that produces this instructive signal to change the song.
LMAN is pretty much in control.
Yeah, so LMAN itself isn't dopaminergic, but there's some connection, and I don't think it's entirely clear between LMAN and this system with the basal ganglia. Any other questions? Okay. So you can also make much more fine-tuned perturbations to song, okay? This is not an all or nothing thing where, if the bird can't hear at all, the song starts to degrade. And this was shown by the same group many years later by using this setup where they took birds and basically glued on little earphones on their heads so that they can modify anything basically about the feedback that they're actually hearing of their own song. Okay, so they can shift the pitch. So if the bird is singing at one pitch, it actually hears itself as if it's singing at a different pitch. They can change the timing of it, etc., which is really tough to deal with. I don't know if anybody in here ever has played the guitar, specifically an electric guitar, but there's like pedals and stuff you can get that are delay pedals, where if you like pluck the string, the sound comes, like half a second later or whatever when you press this pedal. And it is basically impossible to play something normally if that feedback is coming at the wrong time, right? Because you just are not used to it. And so you can do this with birds and screw with them and see what happens. And one of the first experiments that they did with this was to just see what happened when they shifted the pitch. Okay, so this experiment, essentially they take an adult bird again that has a crystallized song, and then they just shift the pitch up by this arbitrary unit of 100 here. And what that means is that basically the bird is hearing its song at a pitch that's higher than what it's actually singing it at. And then they measure the pitch of the syllables that it's singing. And what they see is that over time, this is a matter of, days/weeks, they progressively shift the pitch of their song down. And this is presumably to compensate for the fact that what they're hearing is too high, right? So if all of a sudden my voice sounds too high, I might start talking lower, right? To try to make it sound normal in my head. This is what the birds are doing. Okay, if you then remove that feedback or shift it back to normal so that the pitch that they're hearing is the pitch that they're singing, over time, this goes back to baseline so that the syllables are back where they started. Okay, so that's an example of a more sort of fine-tuned change in the song, which illustrates the fact that, even in these crystallized songs, they're always making sure that everything sounds all right, right? And so it's this constant feedback, and if what they hear doesn't sound like what the template says, then they will change what they're doing. Any questions about that? Okay, so we talked now a lot about sensory motor learning in birds, and I want to emphasize that although this is not language, like I said, one of the reasons why this is so important as a model is the sensory motor aspect of this, right? And this is something that animals in general do when they're learning a task, and in particular when they're learning vocalizations, including language. So like a baby babbling, for example, they're not just making sounds just for fun, most of the time, I guess, probably. They are trying to match some template in their brain, right? So they're hearing you say things, they're making noises, it's a pretty bad match. As they babble and babble, they're trying to make a better and better match. Okay, and so obviously we learn over time to really develop this sense of language where, you can assemble these arbitrary words together to create complex meaning, but it's not always like that when we're learning, right? So this is my daughter again, featured for the second week or second lecture in a row. This is when she was, I think, 2-ish, just turned 2. So, she can't read. She can't really even, maybe it was before she turned 2. I don't know. Anyway, it was a while ago. She doesn't know the meaning of most words. She can't really say most words, but she had these favorite books that she essentially memorized, right? And so, but when you would listen to her, it would sound something like this. So this, for any aficionados out there, is the Big Red Barn. Is that right? Big Red Barn? Anyway, it's been a while.
Oh, Dada, it's what?
No, it's
Daddy
too quiet.
ate Papa, Daddy, Papa. Ask Baby, oh, nice. Daddy, what's this? What? Papa, Papa, boy, oh, that's.
Then she realizes that I'm watching. But basically, the idea is that what she was doing was not actually saying words. She was making sounds that rather closely matched the words in the book. She doesn't know what the words in the book actually mean, but she's like flipping through the book and making sounds that are essentially matched in their timing and meter to the way that we read it to her, okay? And this is part of the process of learning language for humans as well. Okay, so that's my transition into humans. There are a lot of regions of the brain that are involved in the production of language, and a couple of them in particular we're gonna mention here, and they are called Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And the reason why these are kind of a focus in the study of language is that the site of lesions, usually via stroke, that produce very specific defects in vocalizations or language that are called aphasias. Okay, so aphasias are just some sort of defect in language, and by the textbook, basically, Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias are very distinct. Okay, and so damage to Broca's area essentially produces disrupted language production. Okay, so patients will have halting speech. They will tend to repeat words over and over again. The syntax and the grammar is disordered because they can't really produce the words effectively. Yet, the comprehension of these patients to language is essentially intact. And when they do manage to say things, you know, there's somewhat interpretable sometimes. On the other hand, Wernicke's aphasia is characterized by an ease with the ability to actually speak, but even though there is kind of normal grammar and syntax, so what they're saying resembles normal sentences, their comprehension of language and what they is compromised, so they can't really understand what people are saying, and what they say doesn't really make much sense. Okay, so it sounds like they're using normal-ish language, but what they're saying is just sort of nonsensical. So these are some very, very old videos that illustrate sort of the classic distinction between these two aphasias.
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good.
See, so he understands the question.
Ache and
Okay, so as you can see, it seems like he understands what's going on. He's trying to answer the question. He just can't get the words out, right? On the other hand, the patient on the right has a classic sort of Wernicke's aphasia, and you'll see that's quite different.
the foot, you know, boom.
What's this?
You know, the big end right there, end of the football.
End of the football?
It influenced the football right here. The cause that it comes in, see?
Yeah.
The end of it, see? Yeah. Oh, we have all of these, see?
I don't understand.
Well, it's pliable in the together, see? You don't understand it, but it applies in the long thread reed comes from there. And it comes source from the country out through it, see? All the under it, see, it comes up and finally come out here and goes out, see? Get it?
Sort of.
Yeah, it comes out here, see, it comes out here, and here,
Uh-huh.
and it comes in,
Uh-huh.
and it comes out, and bing. That's a good flow, see?
That's a good what?
That's a good flow goes to fly, see, it flows cold, or gives, or kicks out, or bing, or whatever it is. We has no foot.
Okay, so he has no problems producing sounds, at least. I mean, his diction is maybe not great, like it's hard to understand exactly what the words are, but nevertheless, in general, it sounds like normal speech, like I said, but the meaning is not clear. Interestingly, patients who have particular aphasias or damage in these particular areas of the brain and actually can't speak and therefore and hear, so they use sign language. These lesions in these areas of the brain actually also affect this. Okay, so it would also affect writing of language, for example. Any form of language production is disrupted, so it's not just a vocalization issue. Any questions about that? Okay. So, as I mentioned, aside from Broca's and Wernicke's area, there are actually lots of areas in the brain that are involved in language in some way, and honestly, it's not very well understood exactly how language is produced. So this diagram just essentially shows a number of areas where if you stimulate them, you know, like you're doing brain surgery on a patient that's awake, let's say, and you can stimulate various areas, then they will disrupt speech patterns in language, okay? So this seems to be fairly distributed across the brain and not super well understood. All right, questions? Did you have a question or you just?
Yeah, just a quick one. So when it comes to Wernicke's aphasia, are they able to communicate their meaning through other ways, like writing or just drawing it out?
So classically, no. So Wernicke's aphasia should affect other forms of language communication as well. You know, the reality is that every patient is different, and you know, it's not so clean cut to bin them into these two categories. But as a classical aphasia, you would say no, that they couldn't do that. Yeah.
I was wondering if the patients themselves are aware that they're not communicating properly.
Yeah, so are the patients aware that they're not communicating properly? I think that, again, classically speaking, in the case of Broca's aphasia, they are, and in the case of Wernicke's aphasia, they're not. So what they're saying seems to make sense to them, but their comprehension of other people's language and the actual sort of comprehension of their language is disrupted. Any other questions? Yeah.
When they're trying to elucidate something, they're saying something else, which is probably associated with something else. So is it because of there is some kind of remapping?
Right. Is there remapping? I don't know that that's understood at all. You know, again, every case is different. I don't think, like, the association between words is such a fine-tuned thing that it's not understood, I think, in a clear enough way to even ask that question of whether you get, like, improper associations between, let's say, verbs and nouns, or what. Like, this is all stuff that we don't know the neural substrates of or correlates of anyway. So yeah, it's a hard question to answer. Yeah.
When I think about the patient, it's easier for them to say like really common phrases. Like I saw the other patient, and they ask how many grandkids you have. He's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then just derails.
Right.
Stronger synonym?
Yeah, so again, now we're getting into territory that I don't know very much about, but this is also something that happens with patients that stutter, right? Where if they're trying to say something new, they have a lot of trouble saying it often, but then if they're like singing a song or something that's more prescribed or a saying, like that kind of thing, it's much easier for them in many cases. So I think that comes down to not necessarily the strength of the synapses, but probably just a difference in the circuits underlying those two types of communication, right? Whether it's something that's more rote and like memorized versus something where they actually have to go through the production of meaning, right? The association, their own association of words that produce the meaning. That's what I would say in sort of a general sense. Any other questions? Okay, so for the last few minutes, we have time to talk about whether other animals use language by the kind of strictest definition of what we've been talking about today. So does anyone here have a favorite animal language story? There's a lot of them out there. My wife is a veterinarian, and so she thinks animals can do a lot of stuff that maybe I always think that maybe they can't. But so she found this thing on Facebook a few weeks ago where somebody had trained a dog to like press different pads on the floor to be like, I want to go outside, or like, I want food. And I was like, oh, it's not language. And she was arguing with me about this. And so this caused me to do this deep dive into prairie dogs. Has anyone heard about prairie dogs? So there's this famous guy, I think in Arizona or something like that, who had this series of studies on prairie dogs. And essentially what he argued was that if you recorded the sounds that they made, they had these alert calls. So like, you know, if a predator came and they wanted to alert the other prairie dogs, because they're a social species, right? They had these calls, and the claim was that they did all these recordings, and they could, based on the recordings, essentially extract very precise information about what the call was. So like, if a person who was, you know, really tall and is wearing a green shirt came and, you know, approached the prairie dog, their call would be different than if it was like a short person wearing a green shirt or a tall person wearing a blue shirt or whatever. And they could actually like extract the meaning based on these calls. And so I went into this deep dive about this. Apparently, this has been questioned, as things are. And basically, what they didn't account for was the fact that they were recording from a very big group of prairie dogs. And so when somebody went and did it again, but they recorded from individual prairie dogs and like knew which one was making the call, there were very big differences between who was calling, but then within every prairie dog, they basically made the same call no matter what. So it was probably different individuals responding to the different cues. So that one, again, is controversial, but it's one of the better sort of cases that has been put out there. The other argument against it is essentially these are like squirrels, so like, you know, are they really evolved enough to have something as high level as language? No other favorite stories? Whales? Anything? No? Okay. So my favorite, though, even though it's a little bit, I don't know, there's some silliness to it, but my favorite is Alex the parrot. So this, again, this is also controversial. I will definitely say that from the start, and I don't necessarily believe all the claims by the person who did all the research on Alex, but Alex was an African gray parrot, and these are parrots that live for a really long time. They're very skilled at producing vocalizations that match like human speech. And it was actually named Alex based on originally avian avian language experiment was his name, right? Which the researcher Irene Pepperberg changed actually to avian learning experiment because her idea that he was actually producing true language was so controversial that she didn't want to attach that to his actual name. So Alex did a lot of stuff and was raised in this research environment, and learn to do things that are kind of incredible. So I'm going to show this video. This is my favorite video of the year. So here we go. Hopefully you can hear it okay.
Alex, what matter?
Whoa.
That's right, you're a good
Alex
boy.
can answer different questions.
By the way, he said wool. I literally watched this like 30 times trying to figure out what he said there, and I think he said wool. Okay.
It's about the same object.
Come on, how many corners? What shape? What shape?
Four. Corner.
Four corner, good boy.
Alex hasn't just learned to say
You
a
gotta tell
certain
me.
word when he sees a
Look at the-
particular
how many?
object. He's
How
paying
many?
attention to the questions.
How many?
Two.
That's right, you're a good boy. No,
go
sweetie.
back?
No, you can't go back yet. You gotta...
You want some water?
All right. Do you want some water, or are you just asking to interrupt? You're just asking to interrupt. I know you.
Go back.
I know you. Okay. Look. What color bigger? What color bigger? Green. Oh, you're a good boy. Okay, Alex, look. Look what I got for you. Hey, look. Look at all these neat toys. Look. Hey, look, can you tell me, on the tray, how many green block? How many green block? Look on
This
the
is
tray,
a
how many
miniature logic
green
problem.
block?
Alex can't just count up all the green things, and he can't just count up all the blocks. Alex has never been trained with this particular collection of things.
How many green block?
Two.
Good parrot. 2 green block. 2. Good parrot. One of the things Alex doesn't have is a knee-jerk response to the types of objects that you present him. He can look at 2 objects and answer several different types of questions about those objects, or he can look at a novel collection of items and answer questions about that collection. What this shows us is that he really understands what those questions mean.
Okay, so, I mean, I love this video. Like I said, Alex is adorable. But there is controversy over whether he's really doing what they claim he's doing, because animals are capable of learning such, like, subtle cues that there's a possibility that he was essentially being cued to do all of these things. Like, there's a famous example of a horse from many, many years ago that was supposed to be able to do math or whatever, but, like, in the end, it was just being cued by its handler, even though the handler didn't realize he was cueing him. It's like just these subtle things that get picked up. So it remains controversial. Unfortunately, Alex actually died an early death. So when he was about 30, these parrots usually live to about 80 or so. And so there's never been another parrot quite as good as him. There's a whole book about this, if you're interested in Alex, called Alex and Me. And apparently his last words when she left him the night that he died were, "Be good, I love you." And then he died. I know, sad. So anyway, an amazing bird. I will see you on Friday.